In the world of Breaking Bad, death rarely feels random in the city of Albuquerque, and with each person that gets put in the ground either by a gunshot, poison, or even by explosion, these are all echoes of choices made long before the moment itself. Choices made by a man named Walter White. And although he didn't pull every trigger, or was even in the same room when some of these deaths happened, he's tied to nearly every corpse that falls across all 5 seasons. And maybe there's an argument to be made that for some of his victims, death was the only option. But off the top of my head, I can only think of 2. And to prove it, throughout this video, I'll be going over how nearly every character death that occurs in Breaking Bad is linked to Heisenberg himself. Whether it's by setting a chain reaction in emotion, or just not doing anything to stop it from happening, Mr. White has more than his fair share of blood on his hands. So let's go ahead and dive into the world where the meth is blue and the scenery is filtered yellow. But before we get started, if you could leave a like on this video to support the channel, I'd appreciate it. So when Walter had to take a life for the very first time, it didn't come from a place of power. It came out of pure survival. Because when he trusted Jesse to find someone to buy their product, things didn't exactly go according to plan. Because a few days prior, Emilio Koyama, who was Jesse's old partner, just so happened to be arrested on the same day Walter went on his ride-along. And when he was bailed out by his cousin Krazy-8, Jesse coincidentally stopped by to try to sell him some of the meth that he just cooked. But with Emilio under the assumption that Jesse was the one to set him up and he's now working with somebody else, he's forced to bring the 2 low-level dealers out to the RV to meet with Walter in order to make a deal. But when Emilio recognizes Walter as someone who might be working with the DEA, they decide to kill both him and Jesse. But thinking quick on his feet, Walter tells Krazy-8 that he'll teach him his recipe, and in exchange, they let them go. And in my opinion, Krazy-8 was going to kill them regardless, and Walter may have had the same thought as well, because once he had them in the RV, he'd use his chemistry knowledge to make phosphine gas and lock them both inside to choke to death on the fumes. And it might have worked on Emilio, who seemed to die almost immediately, but for Krazy-8, he would suffer a more personal death. And this is what I mean when I say that an argument can be made that death was the only option, because when Krazy-8 didn't die from the gas, he was dragged down to Jesse's basement and chained up like a dog. And with Walter in charge of disposing of him, he finds out that it's not so easy to take a life face to face. And after chugging a few beers with him, he was actually considering just letting him go. But when he discovered a plate shard missing from a broken piece of plate, he realizes that freeing him would be a fatal mistake. So given no other choice, Walter strangles Krazy-8 with a bike lock, not because he wants to, but because he has to. And this would be the last time that we see Walter even weighing the pros and cons of taking a life. Next up, we probably have one of the most iconic characters in the series, Tuco Salamanca, a man who can go from your best friend to your worst nightmare in a split second. And you're probably thinking, Walter wasn't the one to kill Tuco, that was Hank. But although Walter wasn't the one to pull the trigger, it was because of his direct involvement with Tuco that led to the shootout in the first place. Because before Walter and Jesse started doing business with him, there was an interaction between Skyler and Jesse that would eventually put him on Hank's radar. And that was the fact that Walter told Skyler that Jesse was selling him weed. And after confronting him with some of the most legendary words ever spoken,
"My name is Skyler White, yo. My husband is Walter White, yo."
Jesse agrees to stay away from Walter. And after admitting to his family that he has cancer, they would forget about the whole thing for a while. But not wanting to take money from his old friends to pay for his treatment, he decides that he's going to make money the only way he can, which is cooking and selling meth, because that just worked out so well the first time. And when the money wasn't coming in fast enough, they decided to partner up with local drug kingpin Tuco Salamanca. And at first, they did have a rocky start with him nearly beating Jesse into a coma with a sack of money. But after Walter came in and literally blew up his spot, there would be a sign of mutual respect between the 2 parties. And one day, during a deal, one of Tuco's guys speak out of turn, which for Tuco, that's just not something that he would tolerate. So he does what any short-tempered drug addict would do when he's trying to establish dominance. He beats his own guy to death right in front of Walter and Jesse. And not too much longer after that, the paranoia would set in and he would end up kidnapping them both. But what Tuco did not anticipate would be how far Walter's brother-in-law would go to find him, which was to track down the parents of his supposed weed dealer, figure out the kind of car he drove, then tracked it to where Tuco's hideout was. And it was all possible because Walter told Skyler that he liked to smoke a little weed. Crazy, huh?
Do not sell marijuana to my husband.
Okay.
The next person on the chopping block happens to be someone very close to Jesse, and he's the literal definition of the word collateral damage. And that goes to Mr. Combo Christian Ortega. See, after the entire Tuco situation was taken care of, Walter and Jesse once again started to cook meth. But no longer wanting to just be a dealer on the corner, they decided to bring in Jesse's friends, Badger, Skinny Pete, and of course, Combo. And at first, things are going pretty well. They're bringing in a good amount of money each week without any problems. But when Walter suggests that they expand their territory to move more product, that's when the issues start. Because not only would Badger be arrested, but the very next week, Combo, who's now basically selling in someone else's territory, would end up being shot dead on that same street corner. All because Walter had this obsession of wanting more.
It's not our territory.
Sure, they won't like it. But I say they're not going to do a thing about it.
A few moments later.
Another person who suffers from Walter's greed would be Jesse's first girlfriend, Jane. A woman who, when we first see her in the show, is a recovering addict as well as Jesse's landlord. And they take a liking to each other fairly quickly. But after Combo's death, she would try to convince him to go to a meeting and stay away from the drugs. But Jesse would rather just kick her out and get high by himself. And right when she was about to walk out the door, she instead would join him and break her sobriety. And while that's going on, Walter's trying to get a meeting set up with this big-time drug dealer who Saul connected him with. And after getting a meeting, Jesse would show up high out of his mind and he would even leave before ever meeting the drug dealer. But for Walter, he stays and waits patiently and would eventually introduce himself to Gus Fring. And the very next day, he's called to do a deal. But this deal is very time sensitive, and with Jesse being the person holding the product, Walter calls at least 30 times to try to get a hold of him. But he would get voicemail every time, and that's because both Jesse and Jane are slumped over on heroin. So after breaking into Jesse's house and slapping him awake, Walter's able to get the product, make the deal, and collect the money. And with Walter looking at Jesse as somewhat of a surrogate son, he decides to hold on to his money until he can get clean. Because the way he sees it, in his current condition, if Jesse were to get that money, he would overdose and be dead within a week. But the way Jesse would see it, he's a grown man and he can make his own choices. And after telling Jane exactly how much money Walter owes him, she would start to make a plan of her own. And when her father finds out that she's back on drugs, he gives her 1 day to get her stuff together because he's sending her to rehab. But within that time frame, she would call to threaten to expose Walter if he doesn't give Jesse his money. So, without much of a choice, later on that night, Walter shows up to drop off Jesse's half of the money. And it would seem that they would go their separate ways. But after going to a bar and coincidentally meeting Jane's dad there, he gives Walter some advice, and that's for him not to abandon family no matter what. So when deciding to go back to Jesse's house to apologize, he would see both Jesse and Jane sleeping and once again out on heroin. And when trying to shake Jesse awake, it would cause Jane to roll over on her back, and seconds later, she would start to vomit and overdose. And when Walter rushes over to her side, he would almost try to save her. But then, he thinks for a moment. And this was the same woman who threatened to expose him even after getting the money.
How do I know she'll keep quiet?
I guess you don't.
So, instead of rolling her over and saving her life, he would watch as she chokes to death on her own vomit. Because, without Jane, he knows that Jesse would come right back to him. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. And connected to Jane's death would also be the Wayfair 515 plane crash. Because Jane's father was the air traffic controller for that flight. And instead of him grieving at the loss of his daughter, he decides to come back to work only after a week. But almost immediately, it becomes obvious that he definitely needed more time off.
Jane, Mike 21, turn heading. Disregard.
Because in the middle of him calling out flight patterns and call signs, he would cause 2 planes to crash into each other right above Walter's home and killing 71 people on board. And even though the blame did go on Donald Margolis, every death on that plane is directly tied to Walter himself. During season 3 of Breaking Bad, the Salamanca twins are introduced, and their mission was to avenge the death of their cousin Tuco. And even though it was Hank that put him down, their real target was Walter. And the person calling the shots was their wheelchair-bound uncle, Hector Salamanca. Let me explain. Back during season 2, after kidnapping both Jesse and Walter, Tuco was able to get a hold of their IDs. And it was at that moment that the name Walter White was permanently engraved in Hector's mind.
I thought your name was Heisenberg. Walter Hartwell White.
Because we know that Hector didn't have any real beef with Hank. I mean, he wheeled him into the interrogation room with Jesse, and he barely made eye contact with him. Except for, well, shitting himself in the nastiest way that I've ever seen. But that can be chalked up to him just not liking the police. And when Gus figures out that the Salamancas want Walter dead, he would steer their rage towards Hank. Because not only is he doing business with Walter at this time, but by sending them to Hank, then making a call to warn him, he would essentially remove the most dangerous of the Salamancas from his list of problems to deal with. And during a shootout in a parking lot, Hank kills Leonel right on the scene. And as for Marco, he'd be taken care of by Mike, who sneakily injects him with something and walks out the hospital like a ghost. And this is one of those situations where luck as well as timing plays a huge role into Walter's life as a drug manufacturer. Because early on in the season, the Salamanca twins were inside Walter's house and sitting on his bed just waiting for him to get out the shower. And if it wasn't for Mike giving Gus the heads up on what's about to happen, Walter would have met his end right there. And the twins, as well as Hank, would have never even crossed paths. But I guess this just goes to show how well Gus was at playing the game of 4D chess. Now, when it comes to the two gangbangers that killed Combo, this was the moment that I feel that Walter was completely okay with killing. Because early on in that same episode, Jesse was going to use Wendy to deliver some rice-infused burgers to the gangbangers and have them die that way. But when Walter figures out his plan, he tells Gus, who brings Jesse to a meeting where him and the gangbangers have to squash their beef. And not really given much of a choice in the matter, he would have to shake the hands of the same people who killed his best friend and later on would also kill the younger brother to his girlfriend. So, feeling like no one else has his back, he decides to handle this himself. And after snorting some meth off a CD, he would just walk up to them and tries to shoot them. But given the circumstances, it was 2 against 1 and they both had guns, and not to mention that they see him coming. And had it not been for Walter, who did one of the most unexpected things that we've ever seen him do, Jesse would have been shot dead on the street just like Combo. But instead, Walter came through with his Pontiac Aztek and ran over the gangbangers. And when one of them tried to drag themselves towards a gun, Walter jumped out of his car, ran over, grabbed the gun, and shot the man in the head. And this just goes to show that the love that Walter has for Jesse outweighs the friction that he would later on have with Gus. And that friction would come a lot faster than he would think, because not too much longer after that incident, Gus would have a plan on getting rid of Walter and replacing him with Gale, who was actually the person who built the lab in the first place. And knowing that he's probably living on borrowed time, Walter seeks out Jesse and tells him to figure out where Gale stays. Because if they want to have any chance of being alive, they're going to have to make sure that they're the only chemist that Gus has, which would mean taking Gale out the picture even if Walter has to do it himself. And what makes this moment so impactful is the fact that Walter and Gale get along great, and he sees a lot of himself in a young chemist. But if it's between Walter and Jesse versus Walter and Gale, Walter and Jesse comes on top every time.
When you make it Gale versus me or Gale versus Jesse, Gale loses.
And the same day that Jesse gives Walter Gale's address, that would be the same day that Walter's time runs out. And when he tries to leave to get to Gale's place, he'd be picked up by Victor and brought to the lab. And as him and Mike say that there's a chemical leak down in the lab, Walter knows exactly what's about to happen. And to buy himself more time, he says that he knows where Jesse is. And because Mike is also looking for Jesse, he would give Walter the opportunity to make a call. But instead of giving up his partner, he tells Jesse that he would have to be the one to kill Gale because they're about to kill him. And as much as Jesse didn't want to have to take another life, in order to save his partner, he knocks on the door, looks Gale right in the eyes, and would shoot him in the face, all because Walter told him to. Now, when it comes to the feud between Gus Fring and Hector Salamanca, that wasn't something that Walter found out until the very last episode of Season 4. And with him already being actively hunted by Gus's men, he would decide to use their hatred for each other as a weapon to essentially clear the board. And using nothing but a pipe bomb and Gus's ego, Walter's able to team up with the only person who hates Gus just as much as he does, Hector Salamanca. And by luring Gus in with the false pretense that Hector spoke to the DEA, Gus would come to the nursing home that Hector is in and would decide to wipe out the Salamanca bloodline once and for all. And by the time he figured out what was going on, it would be far too late. Because with just a few taps from a bell, an explosion is triggered that shakes the entire nursing home and leaving nothing behind but a charred wheelchair. And because Gus took out the cartel and Walter took out Gus, that left the entire Southwest Territory to be claimed by Walter, Mike, and Jesse. Next up, we have someone else who was also a victim of collateral damage. A young boy who was just riding his dirt bike through a desert, and his name was Drew Sharp. And sadly, that same day, a train heist would be going on that involved stealing over 1,000 gallons of methylamine. And included in this heist would not only be Walter, Jesse, and Mike, but also a new player, a man named Todd. and he was needed to do the job that Walter and Jesse couldn't, which was to be on top of the train and fill the top hatch with water. And although it was a very close call, the crew did manage to successfully pull off the heist. But the problem came shortly after they started to celebrate, and when Walter looked over to his right, he would see Drew Sharp only a few feet away. Then Jesse notices, and last Todd would turn to see the boy. And with no idea how much he saw, they would all stand paralyzed, not exactly knowing what to do. But Todd, without thinking, would quickly pull out his gun and shoot the boy dead. Now, in Walter's defense, he had no idea what Todd was capable of. I don't think anybody did. But at the same time, a vote was cast on whether to keep him on the payroll or get rid of him. And both Walter and Mike chose to keep him on the payroll. So I can't really give him that much of a pass, because what they should have done is have Kubi be a part of the train heist, Huel drives the truck, Jesse gets on top of the train. That way, any damage could have been mitigated. So I'm not giving Walter a pass because he's directly responsible for Drew Sharp's death by trusting a psychotic fumigation specialist.
What's your name?
Todd, sir.
What's your name again?
Todd.
Todd.
Now, when it comes to Mike Ehrmantraut, he's the only person who I have a problem that Walter killed, because he should have known better. He knew that Walter had poor judgment, and he even said it himself that Walter was a ticking time bomb.
You are a time bomb.
He said it!
Tick, tick, ticking. And I have no intention of being around for the boom.
And even still, he chose to work with them. But after Mike's lawyer got caught up with the DEA, he was forced to go into hiding and would eventually have to leave town. But before he does, he would send Walter to get a bag containing money, guns, and everything he would need to go on the run. And when he meets up with Walter, he tells him something that he's been wanting to get off his chest for a long time.
We had a good thing, you stupid son of a bitch. You could have shut your mouth, cooked, and made as much money as you ever needed. But no, you just had to blow it up. You and your pride and your ego. If you'd done your job, known your place, we'd all be fine right now.
But after saying all that, he should have at least checked the bag while he was still standing in front of Walter. That way, if he would have seen a gun was missing, he could have acted accordingly, and maybe even just killed Walter right there. But instead, when he least expected it, Walter shot and killed Mike because he hurt his feelings. And from there was nothing stopping him from going after the 9 guys he was protecting in prison. And after getting the names from Lydia, he was able to have them all killed within a 2-minute window, all while standing in the safety of his own home. Now, the death of Hank and Steve Gomez is definitely the one that he has the most regret for. And as much as he tries to blame what happened on Jack or Jesse, it's clear to everyone that it was Walter that got them killed. Because when he received the picture from Jesse of what looked like his money, he drove as fast as he can to the desert where it was buried. But it wasn't until he got there that he realized that it was all a setup. And when seeing a truck approaching the area, Walter assumes that it's Jesse coming to kill him. So thinking quickly, he calls Jack and brings him to the exact location using the coordinates where his money was buried. But when seeing that Jesse was working with Hank, he called the whole thing off and willingly surrendered. And just when it looked like Walter was finally going to pay for his crimes, 2 cars pulled up and Jack and his crew popped out with a lot more firepower than just a pistol and a shotgun that Hank and Gomez was carrying. And when the bullets started to fly, as much as they tried to hold their own, they stood no chance against Team Jack. And when the dust was settled, Hank was forced to watch Walter beg for them not to kill him, even offering his money for them to just walk away. But unfortunately, Hank knew that his fate was sealed the moment Walter started to negotiate for his life.
You're the smartest guy I ever met, and you're too stupid to see. He made up his mind 10 minutes ago.
And when Hank died, a piece of Walter died with him, because that was the moment that his empire started to fall. The only reason Andrea and Jack's crew had ever crossed paths is because Walter hired them, but not for them to kill her. He thought he could use her as bait to bring Jesse to her house where the crew could pick him up and take care of him. But at least he had the decency for them not to kill him in front of Brock.
Take him away from here. I don't want the mother or the boy to know.
But things didn't happen that way. Instead, after Walter handed Jesse over to Jack, they kept him as a slave. And when he did try to escape, they taught him a lesson that he would never forget, which was for them to bring him over to Andrea's house and watch as Todd kills her right on the front porch of her own home. And again, although Walter didn't pull the trigger or give the order, he was the one to give Jack the one thing that Jesse cared about. And instead of using her as bait, she was turned into a target.
Just so you know, this isn't personal.
One of the last things that Walter White ever did was try to make things right, and he did so by killing Jack and his crew. But not with a frontal assault, because in his current condition, that would be suicide. And instead, he paid 50 grand for an assault rifle and rigs it to his trunk where he can cut through nearly every member of Jack's crew with the press of a button. And with the only two survivors being Jack and Todd, they would be handled personally. Jack is killed in a similar fashion to Hank, being shot in the face mid-sentence, and Todd is strangled by Jesse for obvious reasons.
Just so you know, this isn't personal.
And like clockwork, Lydia would end up calling Todd with the host that Walter's dead. But to her surprise, the very man that she wanted dead just told her that Ryson's in her system, and very soon, she will die. And after tossing the phone and watching Jesse drive away, Walter would take a stroll around the meth lab. And with every step he takes, he thinks about everything he's done and what he's been through. And in the end, while taking his last breath, he would just feel satisfied.